study of the U.S. If times get tough, and we know the world's constantly changing, right? But if things get dramatically different, less stable, more tribal, more chaotic, less reliable on infrastructure and supply chain in the future, where are some good and bad areas for that? That's what we're going to discuss today. So hopefully you'll stay tuned for that. Also, if you are listening to Alpha Male Podcast on Spotify, and you've listened to it before, I hope that you will scroll down and hit some stars. It seems we got some bad ratings on Alpha Male Podcast, which is fine if somebody genuinely doesn't like the content. I know that sometimes the content is controversial, and saying that men and women are different, it is crazily controversial, and that men shouldn't be effeminate, and a bunch of other things. But if you agree with the message and you like it, I hope that you'll scroll down and hit some stars. For my former Marines out there, maybe locate, close with, and destroy the enemy by scrolling down and hitting some stars. If you genuinely like the podcast and you're listening on Spotify, it's a way that you can support and not cost you any money. I'm going to put in a short bio because I also want to remind you that there is a giveaway for new patrons. Patrons get a lot of cool stuff. This comes from an area study that I posted well before this episode comes out on Patreon, and I went in a lot more pictures and stuff like that. I'm going to make the thumbnail for this episode the main map, and I'm going to talk about it, but I put this out on Patreon. If you think that just that one little piece, that one little post on Patreon is worth $5, there's a lot of other stuff on there too. You can become a patron for $5. Also, whether times are good or bad, you know what you might want as a man? A knife. Talking about in the kind of survival prepper community, one of the things that's kind of usually well respected is the Mora. Mora knife, Mora Niv, made in Sweden. Giving one of those away. Raffling it off the month of March in the year of our Lord 2023. If you want to get entered to win that raffle, you just got to become a patron. There should be a Patreon link in the show notes. So hopefully you do it because you want to support and believe in the podcast and the message. With that, I'm going to plug in the bio, and we'll get into talking about what we're going to talk about today. First and foremost, I am a Christian. That is number one in my life, serving God, following Jesus. Combat veteran, served in the United States Marine Corps and the Army. Also law enforcement veteran, private contractor, state rifle and pistol champion. Professional big game hunter and guide. If you feel called to support, check out Patreon. There should be a link in the show notes. With that, I am your host, Michael Milito, and I am blessed to serve you today. Let me start a little addition to the bio if you're not super familiar with myself and how I live. The Bible says we are strangers and pilgrims on the earth. By God's grace, I walked it out pretty literally. I'm a neo-nomad. I joined the Marine Corps at 17. I have been moving around ever since. My wife and I live as neo-nomads, especially since starting to do the podcast full time. Looked at it circumspectly. So how can we cut out one of our biggest expenses? Rent. Well, we can live as neo-nomads. So we do. And way before that, I also traveled quite a bit. And I've lived in many states. I think, and I wouldn't swear to this because the Bible says don't swear anyway, but I do believe I've been to all 48 contiguous states. I haven't been to Alaska and Hawaii. By God's grace, soon we'll be going to Alaska. Don't really have a desire to go to Hawaii unless they change gun laws there. That being said, I think I've been to all 48 states, and I have lived in quite a few. And I'm only going to count the ones that I would consider living in, and that could be a sliding scale. I'm not going to count the ones I lived in as a young child, because I don't really remember. These are not in chronological order, just order that I've lived on the map. New Hampshire, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Arkansas, Nebraska, Arizona, Idaho, Nevada, California, Oregon. Also, by God's grace, ever since I was young, some of my earliest memories are running around outside with a gun, and doing stuff like that. In fact, I went back to where my mom lives, where I spent a big chunk of my childhood, and was visiting somebody pretty close back there who was quite a bit older and in poor health at the time. I thought it would be good to go see her because I don't know if I'll get ever a chance to see her again. And we're talking about when I was a kid, and she says, I remember you just running around with a knife. And I thought, yeah, I pretty much still do that. So the point of that is that pretty much wherever I go, I like to forage and try and live off the land and go out and shoot and hunt and all those kind of things. By God's grace, I have since my youth. So that all that put together, being a survivalist, being a prepper, I don't apologize for that. All that kind of plays into this area of study we're going to talk about today. And let me start by saying this is a complex subject and a complex topic. Something I have either intentionally or inadvertently been gathering intelligence on my entire adult life. And to try to boil it down into one podcast episode, well, it's a gross oversimplification. So keep that in mind. Also keep in mind, a lot of people have bias. A lot of people, and this is not me, and I have a hard time wrapping my head around this, but a lot of people just live in one place. Like they're from there, they grew up there. My best friend's that way. Small town, grew up there. One of my first girlfriends is now his wife, to let you know how small a town it is. And I love them both and wish them both the best. But a lot of people are like that. Like they grew up in a small town, they live in a small town, their parents were from there. And because they have this sentimental attachment to a place, they want to justify reasons why it's a good place to live. A good place for survival, a good place for the end of the world as we know it, whatever the case may be. I would ask, if that's you, to put emotions on the shelf for a while. That's part of being an alpha male. Look at things circumspectly, logically. You've been given a brain and reason. Don't try and fit a square peg into a round hole. If somewhere is not good, then, man up and realize that. And if you're not willing to leave now, maybe have a plan to leave. And where do you go? But just beware of confirmation bias, and because you have chosen a place to live, that's got to be a great place, and here's all the reasons why. Just realize I come at that from a very different way, because I'm a neo-nomad. I'm a stranger and a pilgrim on the earth. My wife and I are traveling around the country, and have been for quite a while, to try and find where we might want to live. I'll maybe get to that more at the end, but would like to go see Alaska by God's grace in the coming months. But we're looking at stuff like that circumspectly. Like, we don't have a tie to anywhere. Like, I have family in different places, and she does too. And I love my family. She loves her family. But I'm not going to live somewhere unless they really need me to take care of them for that reason. So hopefully you can use me in this. Hopefully I can serve you. I'm here to serve you and give you this information. Okay, enough of a preamble. Let's get into it. Natural or tangible resources and data. And there's a lot that goes into this, right? I said it's complex. But climate, right? Some places have a really harsh climate. And we've made ourselves be able to live in some pretty harsh climates now. But a lot of that has to do with infrastructure. Look at how many people lived in the Las Vegas Valley pre-electricity and air conditioning, right? Not a lot. There was a few springs there. That's why it's called Las Vegas. And there was a little bit of water. But it would not be a good place for millions of people to reside without air conditioning. It's a harsh, unforgiving climate. Likewise, so is Montana. Montana has some harsh winters. It gets crazy cold there. The winters there are hard on American bison and bull elk in their prime. It's a harsh, long winter. So climate. If the climate is what I would consider really harsh and unforgiving, that's going to factor in. You say whole regions in yellow for that reason. The upper Great Plains, for instance, they have really cold, unforgiving winters. And you might say, oh, that's the breadbasket of the U.S. Yeah, it is, because of infrastructure, because they have all kinds of chemical fertilizers and pump massive amounts of irrigation and aquifer water out of the ground. That requires infrastructure. If that infrastructure goes away, so does that stuff. So keep that in mind. So climate. That's a big part of it. Also food, and again, I'm not talking about food that's genetically modified and sprayed with glyphosate, Roundup, and chemical fertilizer and all that. I'm talking about food that naturally grows in a natural environment there. Also, population density, people per square mile, is a big thing. For instance, I have lived out west for a long time, and I am now in Central Florida because my wife wanted to spend the winter with her nieces and nephews and family, and I love my wife. And I am itching to get back out west. Just, there's so many people around here. Florida, I looked it up, has, and you can verify this for yourself by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter is established. In fact, verify everything I say here. You should look it up for yourself. But Florida, to give you some idea, has over 400 people per square mile. Last I checked, Oregon had 17. Now, there's a lot of flora and fauna here in Florida. It's pretty dense and green. But it doesn't sustain, I would submit, if there's no infrastructure, it's not going to sustain 400 and some people per square mile. And what kind of carnage and desolation is going to occur if the grid goes down? Food stops getting brought in on trucks with over 400 people per square mile. And people say, well, I'll go to the national park or the national forest here. And there are a few. But you and how many other hundreds of thousands of people are going to go there, right? The population density is way too high. I would submit, I don't know of a natural landscape that exists on this earth right now that can sustain 400 and some people per square mile. And I'm not talking about in a city. I'm talking about that's the state. Well, population density, that's a big thing. When times get desperate, even when times aren't desperate, but more so when times get desperate, historically, people behave in a way that you probably don't want to be around a lot of people. Especially a lot of people that are not in your tribe, in your similar belief system, that kind of thing. And population density is a big thing. And I want to give credit where credit is due. I'm a patron to a few people. One of those is Pastor Joe Fox, Viking Preparedness. He's a big fan of saying 2 things that'll get you. Your 2 main threats are starvation and people behaving badly. I would add to that water, because clean water when you don't have grid is something I think a lot of people take for granted. But I certainly agree with him there. That is probably your 2 biggest threats. And almost most feasible scenarios I can envision. Starvation, and I'll include water with that, and people behaving badly. Population density absolutely matters. Some people will say, oh, Texas is a great place. It's got so much liberty and gun laws and freedom. And Texas is a fine state. It has some of the biggest metropolitan areas in the country. There are some pretty wide open areas out west, but a lot of that area is without water, especially without water if there's no grid. Like, you need year-round access to clean drinking water, at a minimum, to survive. So just because you love Texas, don't look at it with whatever they say, rose-tinted glasses. Look at it circumspectly. And Texas is a big state, but there's a lot of people in Texas. Also, looking at politics, and I don't want to turn this into a political red versus blue thing. I really don't. But I'm going to, look at it as in freedom and less freedom. I like more freedom. You listening to this might be different. I'm not saying that my criteria should be your criteria. All right, so I'm going to unfurl this map here that I did that you might see a thumbnail of, and which is posted more clearly on Patreon with a bunch of smaller pics of different regions. And I'm going to try and do the best I can with this in an audio format. But I've got it composed of different colors. Good for green, and those are horizontal and vertical hash marks. And then yellow horizontal marks for and that's a scientific term that I came up with. Like, it's not the worst, but it's not great. And that'd be in yellow. And then red horizontal is just bad. Let's start at the upper right of the map. And some of the few places I might consider as good east of the Mississippi you might find here, I would consider coastal Maine. Some of those places might be good. There's a lot of natural resources there and low population density. and it's far enough away. And that's a key thing, because I think a lot of Americans don't store extra gas. Hopefully you do. If you're listening to this, you have like extra gasoline stored. You can drive more than you can get on one tank of gas, but I don't think a lot of America does. And if power goes out and oil refineries go offline and stuff like that, a lot of people are going to be limited to where they can drive with whatever gas is in their car. I think that Maine is probably far enough away from big major population densities that it won't get overrun. Whereas there's a lot of places in rural Virginia, let's say, that are pretty sparse now, but if that happens, a lot of people are going to mass flee the DC area, the Norfolk area, stuff like that. And it's not that big a state. Even if 1 out of 5, households flee to those areas, it's going to be really overpopulated. I don't think that Maine is that way. So Maine, especially coastal Maine, because northern Maine, although sparsely populated, also doesn't support a lot. If you look at like deer population density up in the big north woods, it's not a lot of deer per square mile because there's not a lot of forage there, and the winters are pretty harsh. Coastal Maine, I'd say, has a little bit more resources because you get both the marine ecology there and you get the forest ecology there, and you get resources from both. Hopefully you don't have to flee there in winter. Hopefully you have time to build or get a structure and stack up firewood for the winter, and you have that marine resources too, fish and things like that. So I put that in green. I also put Vermont and a small part of New Hampshire in green as well. Vermont, the Green Mountains, they do have cold winters, but they can grow a lot there. A lot of stuff grows there pretty well, and the population density is low. And I would say a place in Vermont or New Hampshire that's fairly far away. That's why I did not put the southern part of New Hampshire, where most people live and where a lot of people would go. Plain Massachusetts, places like that. But there are places there I would put in green. Also, the very western edge of West Virginia. West Virginia is pretty sparse, but you got to imagine, again, a lot of people from the DC area, from Maryland, New Jersey, are going to drive. And the East Coast states are fairly small, right? If 1 out of 5 households leaves and goes in that area, that's going to be pretty packed. More than I think the landscape can support. But I think you get far enough away in western West Virginia, if you can get there, I put that in green, or if you live there, nice work. It's a fairly mild climate. You might think it's super cold in winter. It is cold there, but it's not cold like Montana cold. Not like minus 40, right? So the western part of West Virginia and parts of Kentucky. Kentucky's pretty far away from a lot of places. Granted, if you get far enough away from places like Ohio. But places that are, again, more than 1 tank of gas, or half a tank of gas, because a lot of people don't keep their tanks topped off, right? If you get more than that away, that whole kind of deep inner Appalachia, however you say it, if you get into that region, and also into the Ozark region. So that'd be my next region in green that's anywhere near the East Coast. That Ozark and Ouachita kind of mountain ranges. Arkansas, a lot of that area I think would be in green. Some very small parts of Missouri. There's, unlike a lot of places, a decent amount of attainable clean drinking water. A lot of Oklahoma is pretty sparse and dry, but some of it isn't. The eastern part there, and a lot of Arkansas. And just make sure you're far enough away. Some parts of Arkansas are pretty close to very densely populated areas in Texas. Texas has some really big metropolitan areas. So make sure that my criteria would be that you're several hundred miles away from any of those. Because where are people going to go? They're going to go where there's more resources when they run out of resources in the city. There are millions and millions of people in Dallas-Fort Worth metro area. Millions is a lot of people. And that's not sustainable there, and a lot of them are going to try to get out of there. But assuming those criteria, there are places there. Pretty much everywhere else is in yellow and red. Obviously red, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, anywhere along that eastern coast, like Norfolk up into Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey. Climate there is great. And there's quite a bit of natural resources there. But I don't think nearly enough to support the population density. Massachusetts. Now, New York is a big state. as far as eastern states go, and parts of it I put in yellow. Even some of the very northern parts that border like the very top part near Canada may be green. But there's a lot of people that live in lower New York, so I would say anywhere even remotely around there it would be red. Again, talking red, and you start getting a little bit farther west, but Michigan, red. The only part I put in yellow would be the UP, the Upper Peninsula. A lot of people that live in Michigan, I think they're going to think that when things get bad, they're going to go to the UP. See it as this like idyllic place. It has really harsh winters, but even, again, if 1/5 of the households go there, I don't see that as sustainable, attainable. Pretty far away, I was struck. I didn't put this on my places that I live, but I was there with my wife's family for a little bit, and I was struck by how far away and how long it took to get from Detroit to the UP. It's a long way. So UP may be yellow, but even if population density wasn't an issue, the harsh winters would be. But there's some resources there. Illinois, Ohio, those places are in red. Population density is high, and there's a lot of places around there with high population densities. Illinois, Wisconsin, the Green Bay area, that's red. That's pretty population dense. And again, Texas, it's either yellow or red. I didn't put anywhere green in Texas, and that might make a lot of Texans upset. And there may be some little hidden gem pockets there, but again, a lot of people in those big metroplex areas are going to flee there, I think, if they have time. And where are they going to go? If you start talking West Texas, there's some beautiful wide open country out there. I love wide open western desert ecosystems, but you got to have somewhere with water, and somewhere you can get water without infrastructure, not like grid water. So again, yellow or red. Freedom-wise, Texas is pretty good. All right, going to the west, the western states. Coastal Washington and Oregon. They're big, big states, and they have a low population density. A lot of people, when they think of those states, they think of Seattle and Portland. Those are very tiny pockets in a very big state. Whereas back east, you have a bunch of cities surrounded by pockets of wilderness. In those states and out west, a lot of times, you have giant swaths of wilderness with little pockets of cities. And Oregon has like 17 people per square mile. Even if one out of every 5 families goes to the coast, there's a lot of coast. There's a lot of coastal area. I don't mean like just the beach. Like for quite a ways inland, it's very green, very lush rainforest. It has a lot of flora and fauna. It has a lot of naturally occurring food per square mile. So coastal Oregon, coastal Washington, and that entire Columbia River Gorge, all the way up into Idaho, all green. It's it's not densely populated. Idaho has got a lot of green, but less than some people might think. The northernmost part I put in yellow because the winters there are super cold, and I had a pretty cool assignment in the U.S. Army National Guard up there, and my whole area of operation was the northern part of Idaho from the Washington border to the Montana border, and I've been all up and down big chunks of that country. The northern part is really, really cold, but down into Coeur d'Alene and what they call the Banana Belt, down into the Columbia River Gorge, what a lot of people refer to as the Redoubt, it's, I agree, one of the best survival places in the country. And then a lot of central Idaho and those places over to Yellowstone, also very green. And I didn't put where, ironically, the most people live in Idaho. I put that in yellow. The Treasure Valley, it has gotten crazy populated. Even since I lived there the first time, I just went back there again and lived there again for a brief time. And the amount that place has grown, it's just that whole part of southern Idaho, it's dry. There is water that runs through there, but I don't think it can I don't think the natural resources there can sustain that population. A lot of people move from other states, California, places like that, to that part of Idaho. It's just got a pretty high population density in the Treasure Valley, that whole southern Treasure Valley area. But outside of there, there's a lot of green. If you're looking at Idaho, I'd say not that Treasure Valley, Boise, that area. Other parts in the state, very green. Here's one that's going to be a shocker. There's more green in California, I think, than most of the East Coast put together. Why? It's a giant state. I think that people think California and they think Southern California. And then when they think of Northern California, they think of the Bay Area. There's an entire chunk of California north of the Bay Area that's bigger than many, many eastern states. That's very sparsely populated, that's very green, and it's very far away from any population centers. like, it's not even close. And granted, I'm using a cheap map, but I think even giving plenty of room for error. There's way, way more distance between the southern part of California to the northern part of California than there is from the heart of New York City to central Maine. It's a big, big state. And the northern part of that state, I've been blessed to be in many places in the northern part of that state. It's some of the most beautiful, lush, awesome country I have ever seen, natural resource wise. And there's places there that are so remote you would have no idea you were in California. There's a lot of green there in the very northern part of the state. Politics, not so good there. Also northern Nevada, and I'm talking northern Nevada where there's water. I'm talking around Truckee River. I'm talking around Lake Tahoe. And not right in Lake Tahoe proper, like South Lake Tahoe, the city. There's quite a few tourist places there. But even so, population density there is not super high considering all the surrounding area. So that northern part of Nevada's a giant state too, and it's pretty sparsely populated. So I think that's kind of a hidden gem. A lot of Nevada is really sparsely populated, but a lot of it also doesn't have much water. That area does have quite a bit of water, and I'd say it's a great choice. Also Arizona. Now Tucson, I would put in red or yellow, and around the border, especially anywhere around the border, I put in red. California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas along the border, I would put that whole area in red. But Arizona does have some places with water. The Sedona area and surrounding. Some really nice places around there. It has some really wide open areas. I would say, again, nowhere near Tucson, nowhere near that whole area. Phoenix, those kind of places. But Arizona also, again, is a big state. Look at the size of Arizona compared to something like Virginia. It's a giant state with way less people. Also, talking big western states, Utah. Now I would stay away from some of the major population areas, Salt Lake City. But Utah, again, a big state. A lot of it's dry, but a lot of it has accessible year-round water. Colorado. Colorado gets a red X for politics, in my opinion. Like the Denver area, also I would put in red as far as population density. But again, Colorado's a big state, and if you look at the western slope, the west side of the Rockies, very sparsely populated. And I don't think a lot of people, because it's not near anything, any giant population centers. I don't think a lot of people are going to be crossing the Rockies. And it's really not, the western slope's not near anybody else on the other side. So the western slope of Colorado, just a great place as far as natural resources go. And wide open spaces. So as far as natural resources and stuff go, green there. Most of the places I didn't mention I put in yellow. Again, the Great Plains, especially upper Great Plains, really, really cold winters. There's a lot of green and stuff there now with infrastructure. I don't think that's sustainable if there's no infrastructure. There's not, vast herds of American bison roaming there anymore. The soil, I do believe, has been pretty depleted and needs chemical fertilizers to grow wheat and corn and things like that. Put those in yellow because it is sparsely populated, but the climate is harsh and natural resources, I think, are low. Moving away from the map, I want to have you look into this for yourself because I do believe there was a study done by the Center for Disease Control, not like some tinfoil hat organization, said if the grid went down, power went out for a year, something like 90% of the population might die. That's pretty scary. And you might think, well, that's people live without electricity for a long time. But how dependent have we gotten on that stuff? Again, if you're talking the grid, you're talking about oil refineries, you're talking about fuel, you're talking about most food now gets brought in from long distances. If that food doesn't get brought into the cities, what happens? People run out of food even if you have food. What do you think people that are starving to death will do for food? Also, if you're a student of history, you like history, which I encourage you to be a student of history, I hope, look up the year of 536, pretty much worldwide. Some people that had written records said 80% of the population died. Also look at stuff like the Black Death. So it's not unprecedented. I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow or next year. I'm saying we should watch and be ready and be prepared. Being able to provide and protect those around us, especially those being able to provide and protect for, especially those of your household. Now in good times, that might mean just going to Walmart and getting a pound of ground beef for dinner. But what if there is no Walmart? What if there is no ground beef that you can just go buy? What if you turn on your tap and no water comes out? Not to scare you, but I'm not scared. But to prepare you, hopefully. And hopefully this area study has been useful and important. And I haven't been everywhere. Like I said, Arizona's a big state and I lived there for quite a while in a couple of different places. But there's whole corners where I haven't been to. I don't pretend to know everything or what's best for you, but hopefully this was useful to you and helpful to you. If you thought this or any other content was worth contributing and supporting, again, consider going to Patreon. There'll be a link in the show notes. I used to do these podcasts maybe a couple of times a year. By God's grace, people stepped up to support. You get this and Simple Man sermons and Gunfighter Life at a much greater cadence by God's grace, and hopefully that continues. And it's supported, number one, by God, because I couldn't do anything without Him, and by viewers like you. If you want to help support, again, consider going to Patreon. There's a lot of insider content. This post with the map and stuff is just one. Anyway, with that, I'll start with the tactical tip of the day and then end with the tactical verse of the day. We touched a little bit, maybe mentioned guns today. And I do a whole other podcast called Gunfighter Life. And I don't want to turn this podcast into that. But consider training. And if you're thinking, I've been around guns and shotguns my whole life, that doesn't mean much to me. Or in reality, I think. How many people do you know that have driven their whole lives that are not good drivers? Seek actual training. I'm an FBI certified instructor. I am NRA certified. I taught at one of the biggest firearm training schools for civilians in the country, and by that measure, I think probably the world. I'm not here to sell you my training. I'm just saying seek training, professional training. I don't care if that's a basic NRA handgun course. I take basic courses. I still like to take basic courses. The moment you think you're too good for the fundamentals and the basics, probably when you start not being very good. So don't just think that you have a gun. It's not a security blankie. Just having it might make you feel better. I guess so, maybe it is a security blankie to you. It might make you feel better, but neither one of those is going to keep you safe if somebody breaks down your door if you're not familiar and willing and well acquainted with it. Just a mere possession of either one of those things is not going to keep you safe. It's the using and the being able and willing to use the firearm in the right way, in the right manner. Training helps with that. So seek training. That's a tactical tip of the day. If you're looking at buying another gun and you already have, let's say, 4 guns, a basic battery, you haven't gotten training, instead of spending that money on a gun, maybe spend it on training if you haven't never gotten training before. If things do get bad, how many guns are you going to be able to have and use at a time? One long gun, one handgun? I'm not saying you have to have more guns than that. I'm just saying if you're looking at it from an actual perspective of being effective, if you have a couple of guns and you've never had formal training, perhaps think about that. That's all I'm saying. With that, the tactical verse of the day, and it's one I've been meditating on, and hopefully it will be beneficial to you. Cast your burden on the Lord, and He shall sustain you. He shall never permit the righteous to be moved. That's part of Psalm 55. Reminds me of some of the words of Jesus. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. If you're struggling with a burden, I don't know what that is, but I know it's always the right answer to go to God. Always. It's never the wrong answer to go to God. Even in the midst of your deepest, darkest sin, it's always the right answer to repent and turn to God. That's what repent means, turn back to God. Whatever the struggle, God is stronger, He is bigger than that problem, than that burden. So cast your burden on the Lord, and He will sustain you. With that, men, thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.